Night falls hard over the Wyoming Territory. Dust hangs in the air of a boomtown that never quite sleeps. Behind the depot, a lone supply wagon sits in the dark. A figure crouches low beneath the undercarriage. Hands work a bolt loose, quick, silent, precise. Just enough to fail on the road tomorrow, not enough to kill. Just enough to ruin everything one kitchen has spent 3 years building. Footsteps move through the blackness. No shout. No warning. A grip closes hard on the collar. The man twists, breath short and scared. A voice low and cold. "Who sent you?" Larkspur, Wyoming Territory. Spring, 1881. Silas Rourke had asked 11 men for work in 11 days, and 11 men had told him no, not with the same words. Some of them were kind about it, some of them weren't. But it always landed the same place, in the same silence, right after they looked him over head to boot and decided something about him they weren't going to say out loud. He'd stopped trying to guess what that something was, because guessing didn't feed him. And a man could go hungry just as fast wondering why as he could wondering how. So he walked, boots worn thin at the heel, coat too warm for the season and too thin for the nights, a canvas roll slung over one shoulder that held everything he owned, which wasn't much, and everything he used to be, which he'd learned to fold up small and keep quiet. Larkspur sat where the railroad spur met the cattle trail, which meant it was loud in the way boom towns are loud. Hammers, wagon wheels, men shouting numbers at each other across corrals, dust that got into everything and never quite left. He didn't know the town, didn't know a soul in it, which suited him fine most days, because nobody in Larkspur had heard what they said about him back in Ogallala. Nobody here had a reason to look at him twice. Except he needed somebody to look at him at least once, long enough to hand him a broom, or an axe, or a bucket. Long enough to say yes. He'd tried the livery first that morning. A man with forearms like fence posts had looked him over, asked where he'd worked last, and gone quiet the second. Silas hesitated on the answer. Quiet men didn't hire. They just found reasons to be busy with something else until a stranger took the hint and left. He'd tried the freight office next. A clerk behind a high desk hadn't even bothered to look up all the way. Full up, the man said, to a ledger, not to Silas, and that was the whole conversation. 2 saloons after that. One barkeep laughed, not unkindly, and said he had more idle hands drinking his whiskey than he had chairs to seat them in. The other didn't laugh at all, just shook his head slow, the particular slow shake of a man who'd seen 100 drifters come through with the same hollow-eyed hunger and had learned not to feel much of anything about it anymore. A blacksmith, a stable, a man loading lumber onto a flatbed who didn't even bother to answer, just kept working. Like Silas wasn't standing there at all, like the very shape of him had gone invisible somewhere between the road and the request. That one had stung more than the words would have. A man could stand a no. A man had a harder time standing being looked straight through. By the time he reached the east end of the street, the light was going long and gold across the boardwalks, and his stomach had stopped growling and gone quiet instead, which was worse. Quiet meant it had given up asking. There was a building with a hand-painted sign, firearms table, windows fogged faintly with steam from something cooking inside, a smell drifting out the door, onions and wood smoke, and something with cinnamon in it that made his knees feel looser than they had all day. He stood on the step a moment, told himself it was just one more door. Just one more no, probably. And then he'd keep walking, and somewhere past the edge of town, he'd figure out what a man did when he ran out of doors to knock on. Except there wasn't a plan past that. There'd never been a plan past that. Just the next door, and the one after it, and the quiet arithmetic of how many more nights a man's body could run on nothing before it simply stopped asking him to keep moving. He took his hat off before he went in, habit. His mother's doing, God rest her, drilled so deep into him as a boy that he did it now without thinking, even when there was nobody left to notice or care. Somebody noticed. The woman behind the counter looked up from a supplier's ledger, pencil in hand, and Silas Rourke forgot, for one full second, every word he'd planned to say. She was tall, not tall the way some women are tall, where you register it and move past it, tall the way a doorframe makes you duck without thinking. She stood a full head above where he'd expect a woman to stand, shoulders built for carrying weight, hands that looked like they'd hauled more crates than most men's ever would. And she held herself like a woman who had spent a long time being looked at and had made a decision some time back about how she was going to let that feel, which was not much. Not anymore. "Help you?" she said. Flat. Not unkind. Just efficient. The way a woman talks when she doesn't have time to waste on somebody who's about to waste it for her. "Ma'am," he turned the hat over once in his hands. "Wondering if you've got any honest work needs doing." "What kind?" "Any kind. Wood, water, washing, carrying." She set the pencil down, studied him. The way he'd learn later, she studied a shipment of beans that had come in looking a little too cheap for the price on the invoice. Like she was deciding whether he was going to cost her more than he was worth. "And if I haven't got any, then I'll ask down the street." He said it plain. No pleading in it, because pleading never got him anywhere, and he'd stopped bothering with it around door number 7. "I just need food and a place to sleep." "Ma'am." Something in her face didn't soften. Exactly. But it shifted, like a door easing open a half-inch, just enough to see there was a room behind it. "I don't hand out charity," she said. "You should know that now, so we don't waste each other's time later." "Didn't ask for charity." "No." She looked at him a beat longer. "You didn't." She came around the counter then, and he saw the whole height of her, and made himself do the thing he'd trained his face to do a long time ago, which was nothing at all. No widened eyes, no held breath, just a man looking at another person, the way a person deserved to be looked at. She saw him do it. He watched her see it. Something passed behind her eyes, quick, gone before he could name it. She'd made the same calculation a dozen times before, standing right here, sizing up a drifter against everything a stranger could cost her. Wages if he stole, reputation if he drank, time if he was slow, and needed watching every hour of the day. Most of them weren't worth the risk, and she sent most of them on down the road with a coin for their trouble and nothing more. But there was something in the way this one held still, the way he hadn't flinched from her height and hadn't overplayed his ease with it either, that tipped the scale before she'd finished thinking it through. She told him the terms, the way she'd tell a supplier a price, wasn't fair and wasn't going to be argued into being fair. 3 days trial. He'd earn his meals through the term and the small room off the back passage, the one built for a cot and not much else. If he handled himself right, she'd pay him on top of that at the end. Ordinary work. Backhouse work. Nothing that touched money or trust, because trust wasn't something she handed a stranger for free. "Fair enough," Silas said, and meant it. "Byrne," she said. "Cordelia Byrne. This is my place." Silas Rourke. She didn't offer her hand. He didn't expect her to. But she held his eyes a half-second longer than the introduction required, like she was filing his name away next to something else she hadn't decided about yet, and then she turned back toward the kitchen and said, "Come on, then. Daylight's not going to hold itself for you." Her mornings ran on a rhythm she'd built the hard way, trial by trial, failure by failure, over 3 long years of learning exactly how a business survived in a town that hadn't wanted her to succeed at it. She rose before the light, most days, before even Hetty, and walked the length of her own kitchen, slow, checking stores, checking the stove's draw, checking the particular quiet stillness of a room that hadn't yet filled with the day's noise. It was the 1 hour that belonged entirely to her, before customers, before staff, before anybody's opinion of her had a chance to intrude on the morning. She didn't share that hour with anyone, hadn't in 3 years, and found herself faintly surprised, watching Silas fall into step beside her That first full morning, as though he'd always belonged there, that she didn't mind sharing it now. He started that same afternoon, hauling wood, hauling water, scrubbing pots black with grease until his knuckles went raw, and his back found muscles he'd forgotten he owned. A woman named Hetty Marsh ran the kitchen like a general running a campaign, gray hair pinned back tight, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a voice that could cut through the clatter of a full rush without ever once being raised. She showed him his tasks once, with the clipped patience of somebody who expected to have to say everything twice. She didn't have to say anything twice. He remembered where the kindling went, remembered which bucket was for the wash water and which was for drinking, and never once mixed the two up after being told. He didn't wander into her kitchen uninvited, didn't touch her stove, didn't reach for anything that wasn't his to reach for. Hetty noticed. Didn't say so, but she noticed. And a woman like Hetty Marsh noticing was its own kind of report card, whether Silas knew it or not. That first night, once the kitchen had gone dark and quiet, and the last pot had been scrubbed and hung, Hetty found Cordelia at the front counter closing the register. "New man's tidy," Hetty said. No preamble, same as everything Hetty ever said. So far. Tidy men don't usually need the work bad enough to take a trial. Hetty folded her apron over one arm. Makes a body wonder what he's tidy about, and what he isn't. You worried about him. I'm curious about him. Different thing. Hetty's mouth twitched, close to a smile she didn't quite let all the way out. Curious is cheaper than worried. Cost you less sleep. Cordelia didn't answer that, but she thought about it a good while after Hetty had gone home, standing alone in the front room with the lamps burning low, turning the word tidy over the same way she turned over everything else that week that didn't quite need turning over. He was given the small room off the back passage that first night, the one built for a cot and a nail on the wall to hang a coat and nothing else. He set his canvas roll down. At the foot of the cot, sat a long while without lying down, listening to the sounds of a building, settling around him that wasn't his, and never would be, but was. For 3 nights at least, more than he'd had in longer than he wanted to count. He thought about Ogallala. Didn't mean to. It came anyway, the way certain thoughts do at the exact hour a man's guard goes down for sleep. A room much like this one, once. A different woman's kindness, worn thin, fast. Once word, got around about the flower, about the ledger, about a name that had gone from quartermaster to something folks said behind their hands. He'd left that town 2 days ahead of a mob's temper, not because he was guilty, but because innocent men had swung for less in places smaller than Ogallala, and man learned quick which kinds of unfairness he could survive arguing, and which kinds he simply had to outrun. He'd told himself, walking away from that town, that he'd never again let a place get close enough to him, that losing it would cost him this much. He looked around the small room, at the nail on the wall, at the cot that fit him if he curled his knees up at some. 3 days, he reminded himself. Only 3 days. A man didn't lose much, losing a 3-day trial. He fell asleep telling himself that, and mostly believed it. By the second afternoon, nobody had to point him toward the next task. He found it, finished it, found the one after that, quiet as a man who'd rather work than talk, which suited Burns' table just fine, because talking wasn't a thing that got paid for. He fixed a hinge on the pantry door that had been sticking for months without being asked, and did it quiet enough that Cordelia didn't notice until she went to fetch flour, found the door swinging easy for the first time in longer than she could remember. He resewed a torn strap on Odessa's apron between the noon and evening. Rushes, having noticed her working around the tier all morning, rather than take the 10 minutes to mend it herself. Small things. None of them worth mentioning out loud. But a household keeps its own kind of ledger too, one that doesn't get written down in any book, and Cordelia found hers filling up faster than she'd expected it to. Cordelia Byrne noticed something else. She noticed she wasn't checking on him, which was, she realized, somewhere around the second night, its own kind of relief. A relief she hadn't known she'd been carrying until it lifted. Because every man who'd ever come through that door looking for a few days' work needed watching, needed reminding, needed somebody standing behind him making sure the job actually got done and not just started. Silas Rourke didn't need any of that. And a woman who ran a business alone, who'd built every board of it with her own two hands, because nobody else was going to build it for her, didn't know what to do with a man who didn't need managing. It unsettled her a little. She didn't examine why. Midway through the second day, a railroad man came in loud and already half drunk on something stronger than the hour called for, dropped himself into a chair at the front table, and demanded his supper be brought quicker than the room's other patrons. On account of, he announced to nobody in particular, some folks having real work waiting, and some folks having none. Odessa's jaw went tight. Cordelia's hand paused on the register. Silas set down the crate he was carrying and crossed to the man's table before either of them moved. "Supper's coming in its turn, friend," he said. Easy, unhurried, the tone of a man remarking on whether not staking out a fight. "Same as everybody's. But I'll bring your coffee out first, if that'd help the wait go easier." The railroad man looked him up and down, weighing whether this was worth the trouble of a quarrel. "You work here?" "3 days now. Coffee's good. I've had 2 cups myself." Something about the plain, unbothered honesty of it took the edge off the man, faster than an argument would have. He grunted, said the coffee'd do fine, and went quiet enough that Odessa got his supper out at the same pace as everybody else's without another word out of him. Cordelia watched the whole exchange from behind the register and said nothing about it once the man had paid and gone. But that evening, tapping the day's takey, she mentioned it sideways, the way she mentioned most things she didn't want to make too much of. "You didn't need to step in on that. Didn't want Odessa carrying it alone. Or you having to. I've handled worse than a drunk railroad man plenty of times without help. Didn't say you couldn't." He kept his eyes on the crate he was stacking. "Said I didn't want you to have to, this time. Different thing." She didn't have an answer ready for that and didn't try to force one and let the moment pass the way she was learning to let a lot of his moments pass, quiet, unremarked, filed away on that same crowded shelf. Not every face in Larkspur looked at Cordelia the way Mabel Cross did. That first noon rush, an old rancher named Henry Voss came in the way he came in most days, hat pushed back, boots caked in trail dust, and settled into his usual chair without being told where to sit. "Cordelia," he said, "warm, easy. The way a man greets somebody he's long since stopped noticing anything unusual about. Biscuits as good as last week's? Better. Hetty's found a new hand for the butter." Didn't think that was possible. He caught sight of Silas hauling a crate through the back and nodded a greeting, unbothered, uninterested in gossip, the way some men simply were. "New help. Trying him out. Good. You've needed another set of hands in here a long while. Told you that myself. Going on 2 years now. You've told me a great many things, Henry. Doesn't mean I've listened to half of them." He laughed. A real laugh. The kind that filled the whole front room up warm. And Cordelia's shoulders eased in a way Silas noticed, even from the back doorway. Not everyone in this town flinched from her or measured her. Some of them, it turned out, had simply decided a long while back that she was exactly who she appeared to be, and left it there, uncomplicated, the way a person ought to be left. Silas filed that away too. Proof, small as it was, that the town's cruelty wasn't the whole of it, just the loudest part. The supplier's own team gave him a chance to show a different kind of use that same morning. The horses pulling the second wagon of the day spooked hard at a dropped crate, one of them raring enough to set the whole rig rocking, the driver haulingly, uselessly on reins that weren't doing a thing to calm a frightened animal. Silas was there before Cordelia had even come around the counter to see what the shouting was about. He didn't grab for the bridle the way the driver had been trying. Just moved in low and slow at the horse's shoulder, murmuring something too quiet for anybody else to catch. One hand flat and steady against its neck, until the animal's ears came forward again and the wild rolling left its eyes. "Easy," he said, to the horse, not to the driver. "Easy now. Nobody's after you." Inside a minute, the team stood quiet, blowing hard but settled, and the driver was left standing there with his useless reins and his mouth half open. "Where does supply clerk learn to gentle a spooked team like that?" Cordelia asked, once the wagon had rolled on. "Wasn't always behind a ledger." Silas ran a hand down his own sleeve, steadying himself as much as he'd steadied the horse. "Rode plenty of years before that. A man doesn't forget how to read a frightened animal, even after he's spent a few winters counting flour sacks instead of chasing strays." It was the most he'd said about himself yet, unprompted, and Cordelia noticed that too, filed it onto the shelf alongside everything else, though this piece, unlike most of the others, came with an easy half-smile attached to it that she found herself, against her better judgment, wanting to see again. The delivery came on the second day, right in the thick of the noon rush. Crates of dry goods stacked up at the back door. A supplier's boy standing there chewing his lip, waiting on somebody's for it. Silas carried the first crate in, and then, almost without meaning to, because the question just arrived, the way questions sometimes do, before a man's decided whether he wants to ask them, he said, "How many suppers do you run between 6 and 8, usually?" Cordelia looked up from the crate she was counting. Why? Wondering if this delivery's sized for today, or for something bigger coming. She didn't answer right away, because that wasn't a question a man hauling firewood usually thought to ask. That was a question a man asked when he'd spent years thinking in numbers that had to come out even, or somebody went hungry. She filed it away, didn't say anything, went back to counting, but she watched him a little differently for the rest of the afternoon. She tested him, not on purpose, exactly. Or maybe it was on purpose, and she just wasn't ready to call it that yet. The next delivery, she handed him the supplier's slip. "Check the count." He did. Found a short count in under 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic. An honest mix between the wagon and the door, the kind that happened all the time and usually went unnoticed until somebody ran short of flour on a Thursday and couldn't figure out why. He told her straight. Didn't make a show of finding it. Didn't hold it over her like a man proving a point. Just, "You're short. 4 sacks of meal. Slip says 12. Crates got 8. Cordelia sorted it out with the supplier herself and gave him the next count, too, and the one after that, without being asked twice. That evening, with the work done and no reason left standing between them, she asked him where he'd worked before Larkspur. "Cattle outfit," he said. "Big drive, out of Nebraska way. Worked the supply side." That was all he gave her. She didn't push. Told herself she didn't need to know more than that. A man's history wasn't part of a 3-day trial, and Burns' table didn't run on stories. It ran on work done and wages paid. Clean as that. But they kept talking anyway. "You always run it alone?" Silas asked. "This place." "Had a partner once." "Sort of." Something flattened in her voice when she said it, a door closing quiet before he could see what was behind it. "Doesn't matter now." He let it lie. Didn't push either, because he understood the shape of a door somebody wasn't ready to open, having built a few of his own. Started this place from nothing. She offered instead, a little further along, once the silence had settled easier between them. 3 years back. Had $11, a cousin's old wagon, and a recipe for biscuits my mother swore by. Everybody in this town figured I'd fail inside a season. Didn't, though. No. Something almost fierce moved across her face. I didn't, and I don't intend to start now, either. Whatever this town's got to say about a woman my size running a kitchen alone. He didn't have an answer worth saying to that, so he didn't try one. Just nodded, the way a man nods at a fact he respects too much to comment on cheap. They talked instead about nothing that mattered. The weather, the railroad schedule, whether the well out back was running low. A few minutes longer than the conversation required. Walking away from the counter that night, Cordelia couldn't have said why she was still thinking about it. Nothing had been decided. Nothing had been said that touched the business at all. She just found she was still turning it over, which wasn't a thing that usually happened. Not with a hired hand 3 days into a trial. Not with anybody, if she was honest. Not in longer than she liked to count. The next morning, a customer gave her the chance to see him work a different kind of counter. Mabel Cross came in for her regular coffee and eggs, and Mabel Cross had opinions about everything in Larkspur, whether anybody had asked for them or not. She looked Silas over good and long, while he cleared the next table. The particular long look a certain kind of woman gives a stranger she intends to have gossip about by supper time. "New man," she said to Cordelia, loud enough for the whole room. "Where'd you find him?" "He found me," Cordelia said, not looking up from the register. "Careful who you let carry your stock, dear." Man drifting through with no history behind him. Mabel sniffed. "Could be anybody." "Could be," Cordelia agreed. "So could you, Mrs. Cross? Far as I know, you might have robbed 6 banks on your way here this morning." A man at the next table laughed before he could stop himself. Mabel went red and busied herself with her eggs, and didn't say another word about it, though her eyes tracked Silas the rest of the meal like she was building a case file. Silas, drying a cup near the pass-through, caught Cordelia's eye across the room. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her face eased, just for a second, the particular ease of a woman who'd just eaten engoiled pudding. Somebody in their place, and didn't mind being seen doing it. He filed that away too. A small thing. But a man noticed small things when he'd been given so little else to go on. Odessa cornered Cordelia in the pantry. That same evening, arms crossed. The particular posture of a young woman who has an opinion and intends to deliver it whether invited or not. Hetty had her own quiet opinion on the matter too, offered without being asked. One evening while she and Cordelia scrubbed down the stove together after closing. "Man reminds me some of my Thomas," Hetty said, out of nowhere, naming a husband she rarely spoke of. Dead 8 years now of a fever that had taken half the county that particular winter. Not in looks, in the quiet. Thomas never did trust himself to talk much either, not until he'd watched a thing long enough to be sure of it. Folks used to mistake that for slowness in him. Wasn't slowness, was carefulness. Different thing entirely, and most folks never learned to tell one from the other. You think Rourke's the same. I think you'd know better than me, seeing as you're the one who can't seem to stop watching him do his work of an evening. Hetty said it without a trace of teasing in her voice, which somehow made it land harder than teasing would have. "Just saying what I see, Cordelia." Same as always. Cordelia didn't have a ready answer for that, and Hetty, satisfied with having said her piece, went back to her scrubbing without waiting for one. Odessa cornered Cordelia in the pantry. The following evening, arms crossed, the particular posture of a young woman who has an opinion and intends to deliver it whether invited or not. "He's quiet," Odessa said. "Too quiet, maybe. Quiet's not a fault. Didn't say it was a fault. Said it was curious." Odessa picked at a loose thread on her apron. "Man doesn't talk about himself. Doesn't ask questions he doesn't need answered. Doesn't complain. Doesn't brag. Doesn't flirt. Doesn't do half the things men usually do when they want something from a woman running a business. Maybe he doesn't want anything from me. Everybody wants something, Cordelia." Odessa said it plain, without unkindness, the flat wisdom of a girl who'd watched enough drifters pass through this exact kitchen to have formed some theories about the species. The good ones just take longer to show you what. Cordelia didn't have an answer for that either, and let Odessa go on to her evening chores without pressing the matter further. But she found herself later watching Silas a little more closely than she had the day before. Not out of suspicion exactly, but out of the particular curiosity a person develops toward a puzzle that keeps refusing to finish itself. The town talked the way towns do, and Silas heard most of it secondhand, standing in doorways and around water troughs, where men traded gossip like it was currency. He heard about Cordelia Byrne before he ever asked a single question about her. Big as a man, that one. Somebody said outside the mercantile. Not unkind, exactly. Just careless. The way men are careless about a woman who isn't in the room to hear it. Ran her own fiancé off years back. Or, he ran off from her. Depends who's telling it. Silas didn't ask. Didn't want the gossip. But it kept finding him anyway, the way gossip does in a town small. Enough that everybody's business belongs to everybody else. Odessa told him the real version, or closer to it, one evening, while they were drying dishes side by side and the kitchen had gone quiet enough for talking. He left her at the church, Odessa said. Flat, like she was reporting weather. Standing right there in her dress. Whole town watching. Silas kept drying the plate in his hands. Didn't look up. Why? Ashamed is why. Odessa's mouth went tight. Man like that wants a wife folks'll admire quiet like. Not one folks stare at walking down the street. Not one taller than he was. That's a fool reason to leave a woman. Try telling Larkspur that. Odessa shrugged. But there was something under it. Something that said she'd have liked to tell Larkspur that herself. Plenty of times. She built this place up out of nothing after. Never asked anybody for a thing since. Won't, either. You'll learn that quick enough. You stay. How long ago? 3 years? Near enough. Same month she opened this door, matter of fact. Folks like to say she built the place out of spite. I don't think that's it. Odessa set a dry plate on the stack, careful. I think she just needed somewhere that was only ever going to be hers. Nobody else's name on the sign. Nobody else's say over whether she stayed or went. Man have a name, Nathaniel Cole. Not that it matters. Moved on to Denver inside a year. Married a girl half Cordelia's size. And twice as forgettable, from what I hear tell. Odessa's voice had a bite in it that suggested she'd have liked to say a good deal more about Nathaniel Cole, given the chance. She doesn't say his name. Not once. In 2 years, I've worked here. I only know it because Mrs. Cross never lets anybody forget a scandal, real or invented. Silas set the plate down, thought about a woman standing at the front of a church in a white dress, watching a door that never opened again. Thought about 11 men telling him no, and how small that felt now, set up next to a whole town, watching a woman get left standing at an altar. He didn't say any of that to Odessa, just nodded, and picked up the next plate, and let the thought sit there in him, quiet, the way you let a stone sit at the bottom of your boot, until you can stop and shake it loose properly. The trouble started the way trouble in a working kitchen usually does. With a good idea, put in the wrong place. Silas had watched the rear passage long enough, 2 days now, maybe 3, to see the pattern of it. Dirty dishes coming one way, supplies coming another. Odessa threading between both with a full tray, balanced, high, and all 3 crossing the same narrow strip of floor at the exact same hour, every single day, like nobody had ever noticed the collision waiting to happen. So he moved the wash station 3 feet. That was all. Just enough to open a cleaner through. Didn't ask first, because it seemed obvious. Because it seemed like the kind of thing a man fixes, and everybody thanks him for later. Because that was how it had worked at the outfit, where a man who saw a problem solved it, and nobody stood around asking permission to make a wagon run smoother. For 1 hour, it looked like the best idea he'd had all week. The crossing eased. The traffic ran clean. He let himself feel, just for a minute, pleased with it. The particular, private pleasure of a man who fixed something nobody asked him to fix, and fixed it well. Then Odessa came through, with a full load, at the worst possible hour, found her usual route blocked, and had to haul it the long way around at exactly the moment speed mattered most. Her arm buckled a half-second under the shifted weight. A cup rattled loose off the tray's edge, spun on the floor. Didn't break, but the sound of it skittering across the boards turned 3 heads in the front room. Steam from the stove hung thick in the narrow passage, and Odessa's face, when she finally got the tray set down, had gone red with more than the heat of it. Nothing broke. Nobody got hurt. But it cost her 10 seconds she didn't have, at a table that was already waiting too long, and Cordelia Byrne noticed every single one of those seconds, the way she noticed everything in her own kitchen. She found him before the rush had even finished clearing. Move it back. He looked at her. It's a cleaner path. It's a cleaner path that just cost Odessa 10 seconds she didn't have, on a table that was already waiting. Nobody dropped anything, this time. That landed. He felt it land. Deliveries, Cordelia said, and her voice had gone flat and hard in the way a voice goes when a person is explaining something for the last time she intends to explain it. Fuel. Water. All of it threads through that exact spot, at that exact hour, every single day. It's not an accident it sits there. It's a rhythm. One I built. One you've been here 3 days, and you don't know yet. Silas didn't argue that it had worked fine back at the outfit. Didn't say a word in his own defense, because he understood, standing there, that there wasn't one worth saying. I didn't know that part of your house, he said instead. No. You didn't. What can't move? She looked at him a moment, surprised, maybe, that he'd asked it that plain, that direct, instead of arguing his case the way most men would have. And then she told him. The whole rhythm of her mornings, more of it than she'd meant to say out loud to a man 3 days into a trial. The hour the fuel wagon came. The hour the water needed hauling. The narrow window when both crossed Odessa's path, whether anybody liked it or not. The particular arrangement of shelves that had taken her a full year of trial and failure to settle on, back when she'd first opened these doors with nobody to advise her and no money to waste on mistakes. He listened, all the way through, didn't interrupt once. Then he put the wash station back and rebuilt his arrangement around the rhythm instead of straight through the middle of it. By the next day's service, it worked. Cordelia left it standing. Didn't say anything more about it. But Silas understood the silence for what it was and didn't need her to spell it out. Inside his own head, later that night, lying on the narrow cot in the back room, he ran the whole thing over again. Because he couldn't stop running it over. Because that was the trouble with a mind like his. It didn't let a mistake lie quiet once it was made. It picked the thing back up and turned it over and over until every edge of it had been worn smooth from handling. He should have asked first. Except asking first had never once been how it worked at the outfit, where a man solved the problem in front of him, or somebody above him solved it for him, and asking permission just meant somebody else got the credit for the fix, which wasn't Larkspur, which wasn't Burns' table, which wasn't hers. He turned that thought over slow, staring up at the dark ceiling boards. Hers. Every board of this place, every rhythm in it, built by a woman standing at the front of a church one day and standing behind a counter running her own business the next, with nobody's help but her own 2 hands. A man didn't walk into a place like that and start rearranging it because he thought he knew better. He'd learned that lesson once. It had cost Odessa 10 seconds, and it had cost him a look from Cordelia Byrne that he didn't ever want to earn again. So he wouldn't. Simple as that. He'd watch longer, ask more, trust his own instincts less, at least until he'd earned the right to trust them here. He fell asleep still thinking about the church, about a dress, about a door that never opened, wondering, in that loose way a man wonders things right before sleep takes him, what it must cost a woman to build something this steady out of a morning that had gone that wrong. 3 days. That was what he'd been promised, and that was what he got, down to the hour. Cordelia sat him down at the end of the 3rd evening and reviewed the work with him the same way she reviewed any account. No more than the facts. No sentiment folded into it. You handled yourself well, she said. 3 days were worth paying for. She went through the specifics the way she'd have gone through any account. The wood split and stacked proper. The deliveries counted true. Ponscoust true. The wash station returned to its rightful place and rebuilt smarter than it had stood before. She didn't dress any of it up prettier than the facts required, but there was something in the thoroughness of the review itself, the care she took listing every small thing he'd done right, that told him more than praise would have. He'd expected nothing past the agreed term, and he told her so plain. Didn't figure on more than that. You should have. You earned more than that. She counted the wages out onto the counter between them, coin by coin, watched him take it and fold it away without counting it back, which told her something too, though she didn't say what. Found other work yet? Not yet. She didn't ask him to stay. He didn't ask if he could. They stood there a moment, the both of them, the silence stretching out longer than either of them seemed willing to be the one to break, until Silas finally reached for his coat and said, "I'll clear my things out of the room by morning. Obliged to you, ma'am." For the work, for the fair terms. Wasn't charity, Cordelia said. Told you that already. No, he said. It wasn't. He left the front room, and she watched him go, and told herself the tightness in her chest was nothing more than a long day catching up to her all at once. Later, alone, closing up the front room with the lamps burned low, she found she was still turning it over. The same way she'd turned over that first evening's conversation, the one about nothing that mattered. She was still deciding what she thought about it, about him, about the small room off that back passage that had a man's canvas roll still sitting in the corner of it, about the particular quiet of a kitchen that had run smoother the last 3 days than it had in longer than she wanted to admit, when the door opened and a man she didn't know walked in with his hat already off and a look on his face that said he hadn't come for supper. "Miss Byrne, that's me, Garrison Hollis." He said it like a man used to his own name opening doors for him, which it usually did. "I run parties out to the Falls Road and points east. Got a group coming through. Good money in them, ma'am. The kind of money that talks about you to the next group behind it." Cordelia set down the rag she'd been wiping the counter with. "How many?" 24. "On a fixed evening, 3 weeks out. On top of whatever regular trade you'd be carrying that same night. 24. She did the arithmetic in her head fast, the way she did every count that mattered. Tables, hands, hours. Whether Hetty's stoves could carry that kind of weight without the food going soft and slow, whether her own reputation could carry it without breaking. It would be the largest supper Burns' table had ever attempted, by a wide margin. "I need a clear answer," Garrison said. "Not hope. Hope don't feed 24 men on the day." Cordelia looked past him, out through the front window, at the last of the gold light dying off the boardwalk outside. Thought about a man who, an hour ago, had walked out of her front room with 3 days' wages folded away and no plan past tonight. Thought about numbers that came out even, and a mind that seemed built for exactly this kind of count. Thought about how, 3 weeks from tonight, she was either going to prove something to this whole town or fail in front of every single person who'd already decided, years back, what a woman like her was and wasn't capable of building. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I'll have your answer." Garrison nodded, put his hat back on, and left the way he'd come in, a man used to getting what he asked for, sooner or later. Cordelia stood alone in the front room a long moment, after the door shut behind him. Then she walked to the back passage, where a lamp still burned low, and stood in the doorway of the small room, looking at a canvas roll he hadn't yet come to collect. "Not yet," he'd said. About the other work. She hadn't asked him to stay, but something in her, something she wasn't ready to name, not standing here in an empty kitchen with 24 strangers' suppers, riding on a decision she hadn't made yet, was already hoping, He wouldn't be gone come morning. She was still standing there when she heard his boots on the back step, returning from wherever he'd walked to clear his head, and Hesse cringed, and she straightened up fast, the way a person straightens up when they don't want to be caught wanting something. Miss Byrne. Rourke. Rourke. She said his name for the first time that evening, and it came out steadier than she felt. Man came by after you left. Wants a supper for 24. 3 weeks out. He went still in the doorway. You taking it. Thinking on it. Thinking on it alone, or thinking on it out loud with somebody who can count. Something in her chest eased, just slightly, at the particular dry humor in that. Get some sleep, Rourke, she said. If I'm taking it, I'll need you sharp come morning. He looked at her a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and didn't ask what that meant for the room, or the wages, or whether not yet had just quietly become something else. He didn't have to ask. She hadn't said the words, but she hadn't told him to take his canvas roll and go either, and, for one night, standing in that doorway, with the lamp burning low between them, that was answer enough for both of them. He turned in not long after, the small room settling around him, the same as it had the first 2 nights, caught too short, boards creaking in the particular way of a building that had been raised by inexperienced but careful hands. But something about it felt different tonight, less like borrowed shelter, and more like a place of he might, if things went well over the coming 3 weeks, have some claim to staying in a while longer. He fell asleep thinking of 24 suppers, and numbers that needed to come out, even, and a woman who'd said his name for the first time that evening, like she meant to use it again. It was, he thought, drifting off, about the finest kind of tired a man could ask for. Morning came in gray and slow, the kind of light that doesn't commit to anything yet. Cordelia didn't wait for Garrison Hollis to come collect his answer. She found Silas already up, already hauling water, like a man who hadn't quite decided to leave and hadn't quite decided to stay either. Just kept working until somebody told him different. 24, she said. No preamble. Traveler party. 3 weeks out. He set the bucket down. You taking it. I'm taking it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, exactly. Closer to recognition. The look of a man watching a decision get made the way he'd have made it himself. Then you'll need a real count, he said. Not a guest dressed up as one. That's why I'm telling you. She extended his trial that morning. Same terms restated, plain wage, meals, the small room, a clear end whenever either of them wanted it. But the duties widened. Receiving, table turnover, the helper sequence, things that touched money now, which meant things that touched trust. He didn't ask for more than what she offered, just nodded, the way a man nods at a fair price, and got to work. His questions came fast once the planning started. Head count, arrival time, whether the party ate together or staggered, how much clean ware she'd need on hand, and how many hands to carry it. Cordelia watched him fire through it like a man reading from a list. Only he could see. Why do these questions matter so much to you? She said finally. Couldn't hold it back any longer. Outfit work. He didn't look up from the ledger. Makes a man mind his numbers. And didn't go further than that. She let it sit, filed it away next to the other things he hadn't said yet. There were a lot of those. She was starting to notice. A whole shelf of them, stacking up quiet in the back of her mind. They leaned over the ledger together that evening, heads close, counting out loud. Somewhere in the middle of it, Cordelia set her pencil down and said, not quite looking at him, if money never mattered. If I could put anything at all on that menu, no cost to think twice about, you know what I'd choose. What's that? Peaches, fresh ones. Not the tinned kind that taste like the can they came in. She almost smiled. Haven't had a good peach since I was a girl back east. Man who supplies me can't get them this far west worth the asking price. That. So. Foolish thing to want, I know. Not foolish, Silas said. Just particular. She looked at him a beat too long after that, and neither one of them said anything more about it, and went back to the numbers instead. But she remembered it, filed it away, same as everything else that week, on the same crowded shelf. For one stretch of 10 minutes, neither of them said a single word that wasn't a number, and somehow, it was the easiest conversation they'd had yet. Odessa, passing through to bank the fire for the night, caught the two of them like that, heads bent close over the ledger, and said nothing over the ledger, and said nothing at the time. Though she gave Hetty a look the next morning that Hetty returned, with a knowing look of her own, the particular silent communication of two women who'd both seen exactly the same thing and had both already formed their own opinions about where it was headed. The ledger work went on most evenings that first week, and Silas found himself, but more than once, staying past the hour the numbers strictly required, finding one more column to check, one more figure worth confirming twice, when the honest truth was the figures had balanced the first time through, and he simply wasn't ready yet to say good night and cross the yard to the small room alone. Cordelia didn't say anything about the extra time, but she didn't send him off early either, and once, catching herself of refilling his coffee a second time without having been asked, she set the pot down harder than she meant to, and told herself that it was only good business, keeping a hand sharp and awake for the work ahead. She didn't fully believe herself, but she let it be true enough to get her through the evening. Dutch Radnor heard about the supper before the ink on Garrison's contract was dry. That was how it worked in a town the size of Larkspur. Word moved faster than a man could outrun it, and Dutch Radnor had built half his business on being first to hear things and quickest to turn them to his advantage. He ran the boarding house on the West End. Clean rooms, decent food, a reputation he'd spent years polishing into something respectable. And he did not like, had never liked, not from the very first month she'd opened her doors, the sight of Cordelia Burns' eating house, pulling trade that should have come his way. He came in himself 2 mornings later, under the thin excuse of asking after a shipment he claimed had been misdelivered to her address instead of his. Stood at the counter a long moment, looking around the front room the way a man looks over a competitor's land before he makes an offer on it. "Heard you've taken on the traveler party," he said. 24 men. Bold thing to promise this early in your season. "I don't make promises. I can't keep, Mr. Radnor." "No, I don't imagine you do." His eyes slid towards Silas, hauling a crate through the back. "Heard you've got new help." "Drifter, is he?" "He's my hire." "That's all you need to know about it. Just making conversation, Miss Byrne." Radnor smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "No shipment here after all, it seems. My mistake. Good luck with your 24. He left without buying so much as a coffee, and Cordelia stood watching the door a long moment. After it shut behind him, an old familiar unease settling low in her stomach, the kind she'd learned a long time ago not to argue with. "Man's never once bought a thing from me in 3 years, she said half to herself. Wonder what he wanted. Silas, setting the crate down, said nothing, but he'd caught the tail end of it, and something about the visit sat wrong with him too, though he couldn't yet have said why. He found himself replaying the particular way Radnor's eyes had lingered on him, a beat too long, the way a man studies a face he's trying to place against some older memory he isn't certain he trusts. It was a small thing, the kind of thing a man could easily have imagined, tired and half-distracted as he'd been that morning. But it stayed with him regardless, an uneasy weight he couldn't quite set down. Radnor didn't stop at one visit. He tried a second angle 2 days later, sending word through a mutual supplier that he'd be willing to take a portion of the traveler party's business off Burns' table's hands, purely as a neighborly gesture should the numbers prove too large for one kitchen to manage. Cordelia declined the offer flat through the same supplier and told the man plain that Burns' table had never once needed rescuing and didn't intend to start now. Word of the declined offer made its way back to Radnor within the day, the way everything in Larkspur eventually made its way back to everyone. He did not take the refusal well, told the same supplier, with a laugh that didn't sit right coming out of him, that some folks would rather fail proud than succeed with a little help. 24 for the traveler party, Radnor said to the man across his own counter that same afternoon, turning it over like a coin he was deciding whether to spend. That's a lot of supper for a woman running the place alone. She's got help now. Help. Radnor's mouth curled around the word. Some drifter off the cattle trail. That's who's counting her stock these days. He didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. A rumor only needs a crack to get started, and Dutch Radnor had spent 30 years learning exactly how wide a crack had to be. What the town didn't see, what Cordelia and Silas wouldn't learn until much later, was the conversation Radnor had that same week in the back room of his boarding house, door shut, voice low, with a thin, jumpy man who did odd jobs around the depot for whoever paid quickest. "There's a wagon run supply out to Burns' place," Radnor said, not looking up from the coin he was turning between two fingers, a habit of his when he was working out the shape of a plan. 2 nights before her big supper, I want it short a few crates. Nothing that points back to anybody. Just enough to make her scramble. That's all. For now. Radnor's eyes came up, flat and cold in a way that didn't match the easy warmth he wore for the rest of the town. She fails loud enough in front of that traveling party. Word travels faster than any advertisement I could buy. Every party passing through this territory hears Burns' table couldn't handle its own ambition. They come to me instead. And the new man she's got helping her? Drifter. Radnor waved the thought off, though something in the set of his jaw suggested the dismissal cost him a little more effort than he let show. Drifters don't stay. He'll be gone before it matters. He didn't say the rest of what sat behind his eyes just then. A flicker of something that looked almost like recognition, quickly buried. The particular unease of a man who has spent 3 years believing a piece of his past thoroughly dead and buried, only to feel it stir, faint and unwelcome, somewhere at the edge of his vision. By the end of the week, the whisper had made its rounds. That Burns table had bitten off more than a woman her size could chew. Folks laughed a little too easy at that phrasing, the way cruelty dresses itself up as a joke when it wants company. That the traveler party would be better served, better fed, better handled over at Radnor's. Not at everyone repeated the rumor kindly toward Radnor's version of it, either. Odessa overheard a young rancher's wife defending Burns' table plain at the Mercantile, telling the gossiping cluster around her that she'd rather eat a meal built by 2 capable hands, trust her family's supper to a man who spent more time talking about other folks' businesses than tending his own. It wasn't a majority opinion, not yet, but it was there, a thread of it running quiet beneath the louder whispering, waiting for something to pull it forward. Cordelia heard it secondhand, the way she heard most things said about her, standing at her own counter, checking a delivery, while 2 customers at a corner table didn't lower their voices near enough. She didn't flinch, had learned a long time ago not to flinch where anybody could see it. But that night, alone, she stood in front of the small mirror behind the counter, longer than she needed to, studying her own reflection, the way she studied a shipment she wasn't sure about. Too big, too much, too something, always something for this town to just let her be, she thought, unbidden, of the church, of the particular silence in a room full of people who'd all come dressed for a wedding, and were now watching one instead of attending it. She hadn't cried that day, hadn't given the town the satisfaction. She wasn't going to give Dutch Radnor one either. She'd built every board of this place, with hands folks like to whisper about, and she was not going to let his whispering take a single supper away from her. She sat a long while at the small table in the back that night, after the mirror. After the reflection, she hadn't much cared for, turning over a different kind of arithmetic than the one she usually kept, because Radnor's whispering had found the old wound easy enough. The same one Nathaniel Cole had carved into her 3 years back standing at the front of that church. But this time, the sting of it sat differently. Because this time there was a man sleeping in the small room off her back passage who hadn't once looked at her the way this town liked to look at her, who'd stood at her counter that very first evening and simply seen a person asking a fair question. And something about having that comparison so close at hand made Radnor's cruelty land smaller than it might have a year ago before Silas Rourke walked through her door. She didn't examine that thought too closely either. Some things she was learning kept better if a person didn't turn them over too many times before they were ready. Silas caught the tail end of the rumor a different way. Emery Whitfield, who ran the freight line out of the depot, came by with a shipment and stood a long while, watching Silas reconcile two separate stocks, the restaurant's regular trade and the traveler party's allotment, sorted clean and fast. No mixing, no mistakes, in half the time most men would have needed. "Where's a man learn that kind of care?" Whitfield asked. Not idle. Genuinely curious, the way a businessman gets curious about a skill he recognizes because he doesn't see much of it. Silas answered plain. Kept the books for a cattle outfit's supply train. Counted provisions. Made sure the numbers came out even when they had every reason not to. Whitfield didn't offer him anything. Not yet. Just listened and remembered the way a man remembers a name worth keeping for later. "You ever think of freight work?" Whitfield asked, almost idle, testing on the ground, the way a careful man tests ice before trusting his full weight to it. Thought of plenty of things these past 3 years. Mostly thought of eating regular. Fair answer. Whitfield's mouth twitched toward a smile. I run a tight operation out of the depot. Losing money some months to shortfalls I can't account for, on account of not having a man sharp enough to catch them before they walk off a wagon. Man like you'd save me more in a season than I'd pay him in 2. Man like me's got an arrangement here for now. Didn't say it had to be now. Whitfield tipped his hat, unhurried. Just wanted the offer sitting out where you could see it, whenever now stops being the answer. But before he left, he said one more thing. Almost in passing. Dutch Radnor's telling anybody who'll listen that Miss Byrne can't handle this supper. Silas went still. Man's wrong, Whitfield added, and left it there, and went on his way. Silas stood in the back doorway a long moment after the wagon pulled off. Something about the name had snagged in him. And Radnor. He turned it over, hunting for why, and came up with nothing solid. Just an itch. Low and persistent, the kind a man gets when a name sounds like it's supposed to mean something and won't tell him what yet. He filed it away, went back to work. The itch didn't leave him alone that week. It came back 2 days later. It came back sharper 2 days later when Radnor himself walked past the eating house. Didn't come in, just walked past, slow, the way a man walks past something he's sizing up for a fight hasn't started yet. And Silas, hauling wood through the front, looked up and caught the man's face square on, for the first time. Something in his chest dropped. He didn't know the face, was almost certain he didn't. But there was a set to the jaw, a particular way the man carried his shoulders, that scraped against a memory Silas couldn't quite pull whole out of the dark, because he'd seen that walk before. Except where? Which was the trouble with memory. It never handed a man the whole picture at once, just a corner of it, torn loose and floating free, and left him standing there holding it, useless until the rest came clear or didn't. He shook it off, told himself it was nothing. A stranger's walk, and a mind too tired and too hungry these past weeks to trust its own instincts. He tried, over supper that evening, to force the memory loose on purpose, the way a man works, a splinter toward the surface, with a needle, rather than waiting for his body to push it out on its own. Closed his eyes over his plate a moment, ignoring Odessa's curious glance from across the kitchen. and walked himself back through that winter camp, step by step. The supply tent, the ledger, the particular coal that got into a man's hands during the small hours of accounting by lantern light. Nothing came of it, not that night. But that night on the cot, staring up at the same dark boards, the itch was still there when he closed his eyes. And underneath it, unbidden, a fragment came loose. A lantern, swinging slow on a tent pole, the smell of canvas and cold mud. A voice he'd never seen the whole face behind, counting cash into a palm, too fast for anybody to properly account for later. He hadn't thought of that night in 3 years, hadn't let himself. He didn't know yet why it had chosen tonight to come back. Larkspur held a spring social. That Saturday, the kind of gathering a town threw together more out of habit than occasion. Tables set up along the church green, fiddles tuning up somewhere past the wagons. Cordelia didn't often attend, told herself she had accounts to close, told herself the same thing most years, if she was honest, and most years it was even half true. This year Odessa talked her into an hour of it, at least, for the sake of the trade it might bring, and Cordelia stood near the edge of the green, with a carte du ost, the green, with a cup of cider she wasn't drinking, watching do what towns did. Silas found her there, having been sent by Hetty to fetch a crate of jarred preserves for the social table, and stayed longer than the errand required. "You don't care for this," he said. "Not a question. I care for it fine. Folks just have a way of caring for it at me, instead of alongside me." She nodded toward a cluster of women near the punch table, not looking directly at them. "Watch. Give it a minute." He watched. Saw exactly what she meant. Soon enough, the way conversations paused, a half beat too long, when Cordelia passed near enough to overhear. The way a woman's eyes would travel the length of her, top to bottom, and then flick away fast. Caught. They do that every time? Every time. 3 years running. She said it flat. No self-pity in it. Just fact. The way she reported any count. You get used to a thing like that. Or you get good at not showing you haven't. Which is it? For you. She considered that longer than he expected. Some days one. Some days the other. Today's been a fair mix of both if you want the honest count. For what it's worth, Silas said, I don't see what they seem to see when they look at you that way. What do you see then? A woman who built a business out of $11 and a family recipe and made it steady enough to feed a whole traveling party on 3 weeks' notice. Rest of it's just height. Doesn't much interest me one way or the other. Cordelia looked at him a long moment, something working behind her eyes that she didn't put words to just yet. That's a fine speech for a man who claims he doesn't say much. Don't, usually. Guess you're an exception. She didn't have an answer ready for that either, and the two of them stood a while in a silence that had gone considerably warmer than the one they'd started with, before Odessa's voice cut through, calling Cordelia over to settle some small dispute about the punch bowl. Radnor was there too, working the crowd, the easy way a man does who spent 30 years cultivating a town's good opinion, and Silas watched him laugh with a cluster of ranchers, watched him clap a man's shoulder, watched him clap a man's shoulder, watched him glance once, briefly, toward Cordelia with an expression that didn't match the warmth in the rest of his face at all. "He's telling that story again," Odessa muttered, appearing at Silas's elbow with a plate of biscuits. "About the 24. Says he offered to help you out, being neighborly, and you turned him down flat out of pride. That true?" Silas asked Cordelia. "Man never offered me a single thing in 3 years except grief," she said. "But it's a fine story, if you don't ask for the parts he leaves out." Henry Voss ambled over not long after, tipping his hat to Cordelia the same easy way he greeted her every morning over biscuits. "Fine spread this year," he said, of the social table generally, though his eyes lingered kindly on Cordelia rather than the food. "Hope this new fellow of yours is treating you square. He's earning his wages, Henry. That's all the treating I ask of anybody. That's about the fairest standard I've ever heard a person hold to." Henry chuckled and moved on, and Cordelia watched him go with something almost soft crossing her face. The particular gratitude a person carries for the few folks in a hard town who simply never learned to be cruel. Silas didn't say much more the rest of the evening, but he watched Radnor a good deal longer than the man's stories deserved, and the itch under his ribs hadn't quieted any by the time he and Cordelia walked back toward the eating house together, the fiddle music fading slow behind them. "You're doing that thing again," Cordelia said. "What thing?" "Going quiet on something you're not telling me," he almost told her, right then, standing in the dark with the crate of preserves between them, the lantern, the tent, the voice he'd never seen the face of. But it wasn't whole yet, wasn't certain, and a man who'd once had his own name ruined by an accusation, with no proof behind it, wasn't about to hand somebody else's name over on nothing sturdier than a walk. "Just tired," he said. She didn't believe him. He could see that plain enough on her face. But she let it go, the same courtesy he'd extended her more than once already, and they walked the rest of the way in a silence that wasn't unfriendly, just full. 2 nights before the supper, a delivery came in short. Not short, the honest way. The way a mix-up between wagon and door usually ran short. This was clean, precise. 4 crates of dry goods that should have been there simply weren't. And the supplier's boy swore up and down he'd loaded every single one back at the depot. Silas checked the invoice twice. Checked the wagon. Checked the ground behind the wagon, where wheel ruts cut fresh and deep into soft dirt that hadn't been soft that morning. Somebody had stopped this wagon, somewhere between the depot and Burns' back door, long enough to lighten the load. He didn't say it to Cordelia yet, not until he was certain, because certain mattered. Because a man who'd once had his name dragged through the mud over a shortfall that wasn't his doing knew exactly how fast an accusation could ruin a person, and he wasn't about to point a finger he couldn't back up with something solid. So he watched. That was all. Watched the depot, watched the road, watched the hour the wagons ran, the way he used to watch a camp's whole rhythm before he trusted himself to change a single thing in it. The night before the supper, he found what he was watching for. A man he didn't recognize, thin, jumpy, crouched low at the back of the delivery wagon, parked outside the depot after dark, working something loose at the undercarriage with quick, practiced hands. Silas didn't shout, didn't give the man a chance to run. He crossed the distance fast and quiet, the way he'd crossed 100 nighttime camps, checking on restless stock, and had the man by the collar before he'd finished working the bolt loose. "Who sent you?" The man twisted hard, tried to wrench free. "Get off me. I ain't done nothing yet." Yet's the only word in that sentence that matters. "Who sent you?" Silence. Silas tightened his grip, and the man's breath went short and scared. "I don't know his name proper," the man finally said. "Man from the boarding house. Paid me $2 to knock this loose enough it'd fail on the road tomorrow. Said not enough to kill nobody, just enough to spoil the delivery. Description: older fellow, gray at the temples, runs the rooms on the West End." The man's voice cracked. "That's all I know, mister. Swear it. Man never gave me his name and I never asked for it." Silas let him go, watched him scramble off into the dark, and stood there a long moment with his heart going hard and his hands not quite steady, staring at the half-loosened bolt still hanging from the undercarriage. The West End, the boarding house, Radnor. The name arrived whole this time, and behind it sudden, the rest of the memory came loose all at once, the way it sometimes does after refusing to arrive at all. 3 years back, a cattle outfit's supply office. A man who'd come through buying surplus provisions on the side, cash in hand, no questions asked. 3 separate nights, that winter, always after dark, always gone before the camp woke. Silas had only half seen his face once, by lantern light, and hadn't thought of it in years. Not until a set of shoulders walking past a boardwalk in Larkspur had scraped the memory raw again. He fixed the bolt himself, hands shaking, and didn't sleep at all that night. He told Cordelia everything the next morning, not because he wanted to, because the wagon needed explaining, and because he'd decided somewhere in the sleepless dark that a woman who'd trusted him with her whole supper deserved better than half a truth standing in her kitchen. I wasn't always a drifter looking for wood hauling work, he said. Flat, getting it out before he lost the nerve. I ran the supply side of a cattle outfit, counted provisions for over 100 men, kept the numbers honest when the whole camp depended on it. Cordelia set down what she was holding. 3 years back, a winter's worth of flour came up short. Not my doing. But I was the one holding the ledger, and the man who was doing it made certain it looked exactly like it was. Radnor. Didn't know his face for certain till I saw him at your counter that first morning, and even then it wasn't sure. Last night made it sure. The kitchen had gone very quiet. They ran me off the outfit inside a week, Silas said. No trial. No chance to prove different. Just a name nobody wanted attached to their payroll after that, and 11 men in this town alone, who looked at me and decided the same thing before I'd said a word. Cordelia looked at him a long moment. Why didn't you tell me that first day? Because after enough men tell you, there's no opening for that, he said. You learn to ask smaller. You stop leading with the thing that cost you the job before you've said 2 sentences. She let that sit. Something in how she looked at him afterward had shifted. Not surprise, not exactly. More like a picture coming into focus after sitting blurred the whole time she'd been looking at it. He'd direct tonight's delivery, Silas said. Man confessed plain enough, once I had hold of him, to keep us from serving the party, to make sure this town watched you fail in front of every last one of them. Cordelia's jaw set hard. What did you do? She asked. Quieter now, after they ran you off. Where'd you go? Wherever there was a road pointing away from Ogallala. 8 less than I should have most weeks. Slept in barns when folks would allow it, under wagons when they wouldn't. He kept his eyes on the crate in front of him, not because he was ashamed of the answer exactly, but because it was easier to say plain to a crate than to her face. Learned to stop leading with what I used to be. Learned a man can live a good while on very little if he's careful about it. 3 years of that. 3 years of that. And you never once thought to write somebody. Find a lawyer. Send word to somebody who might have vouched for you. Wrote 2 men, first year. Neither wrote back. After that, I figured the writing cost more than it was worth. He looked up at her finally. You get used to a thing like that too, Cordelia. Or you get good at not showing you haven't. She recognized her own words handed back to her, and something in her chest tightened at hearing them. Something particular tightened at hearing them, the particular ache of realizing a person has been carrying the exact same weight you have, dressed up in a different shape. Then we don't fail, she said. Not tonight. Not because of him. Not because of either of us. That evening, with the truth finally listening out in the open, between them and the supper only hours away, Cordelia found she didn't want to spend the last quiet stretch of night bent over a ledger. She found Silas out back instead, checking the wash station. One more time, though. It hadn't moved an inch in 2 weeks. The particular restlessness of a man who needed his hands busy so his mind would leave him be. It'll hold, she said. You've checked it 3 times already. 4th time's for peace of mind, not the station. She almost smiled at that. Sat down on the step beside him, the same step where Hetty had once stood, delivering her verdict on the new man's tidiness, though neither of them knew that particular history. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, with the count, with the crowd, with anything Radnor still has left in him to try. I want you to know I don't regret a single day of this trial, whatever else comes of it. That an easy thing to say the night before 30 strangers test whether we've built something worth trusting. No, she said. It's a hard thing to say. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at her a long moment in the fading light, and something passed between them. That neither one of them tried yet to put a name to. Quiet and steady, the particular ease of two people who had stopped needing to perform anything for each other. "Get some sleep, Rourke," she said finally, echoing her own words from that first extended night. This time there was a warmth folded into it that hadn't been there before. "You too, Miss Byrne." Neither of them moved for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then she rose and went inside, and he sat a while longer under the darkening sky, thinking that whatever tomorrow brought, he had already won something, simply in being trusted enough to sit on that step at all. The day of the supper, Byrne's table moved with a controlled kind of pressure that hadn't lived in that kitchen before. Every hand knew its piece of it. Hetty ran the stoves like a woman, conducting an orchestra she'd spent years learning by heart. Odessa's route ran clean, the wash station, exactly where Silas had rebuilt it around Cordelia's rhythm instead of through the middle of it. Silas checked his sequence twice, more from habit now than doubt. Then Garrison Hollis walked through the door with a look on his face that told Cordelia, before he'd said a single word, that the day had already gone sideways. 6 more joined the party overnight, he said. 24's become 30. I need to know right now whether you can still take them. The kitchen went silent enough to hear the fire crackling. Silas didn't answer for her. That wasn't his to answer. Hetty called out the kitchen's real limit, plain and fast. Silas laid the operational hook of the increase on top of it, straight. No softening it, because softening it now would only cost them worse later. Cordelia did the math in her head, faster than either of them could have followed. "Yes," she said. Before touching a single arrangement, Silas asked the same question he'd learned to ask once already, the hard way, 3 weeks back. "What can't move?" Cordelia answered fast this time. Didn't need to think it over. Trusted now that he'd actually listened to the answer instead of building around it his own way. He rebuilt the sequence around what she told him, quiet, without needing to be watched doing it. The first stretch of the supper held. Not perfect, nothing that size ever runs. Perfect, but it held, plate after plate, moving out of Hetty's kitchen in a rhythm that looked, from where Cordelia stood, almost like music. Then the extra 6 caught up with them. Dirty ware came back faster than clean ware could be readied. Steam thickened the narrow rear passage until a body could hardly see 3 feet ahead. Odessa got stuck mid-step between clearing and resetting, a tray balanced in both hands with nowhere clear left to set it down. A stack of clean plates wobbled dangerously on the shelf above the wash station, jarred loose by the sheer traffic through the passage, and for one heart-stopping second looked set to come crashing down, before Hetty's quick hand shot out and steadied them without ever once looking up from her stove. 2 tables waited past their promised time. Garrison Hollis, to his credit, moved among his own party, trying to smooth what he could, refilling water glasses himself, cracking jokes about trail hunger to buy the kitchen a few more minutes of grace. But even his patience had limits, and Silas caught him glancing toward the door more than once. The particular look of a man, calculating how much of his own reputation he'd staked on tonight going well. "A regular customer near the front?" asked Cordelia, not gently. Whether the traveler party had swallowed the whole room whole, she had seconds to answer, not minutes. Silas found the choke point before she'd finished forming the thought, not from a list in his head, but the way a man reads a room he's finally learned all the way down to its bones. He pulled Odessa off carrying, put her straight on to clearing, held the next seating back 3 full minutes, so cleanware could catch up, told Cordelia plain and honest exactly how much delay he could actually recover, so that when she made her promise to the front room, it would be a promise that held. D'accord. Falsified. Hetty, without being asked, shifted 2 dishes she'd been holding in reserve for the regular trade over to the traveler party's line, a small sacrifice that would mean thinner portions later for anyone ordering seconds, but bought precious minutes. Nobody else in that kitchen had thought to spend. Odessa, once repositioned onto clearing, found a rhythm of her own inside the chaos, stacking plates at two and three at a time with a steadiness that surprised even her, the particular calm that arrives sometimes in the exact center of a crisis, once a person stops fighting the size of it and simply starts moving. The backlog stopped growing. Then, slow, it started shrinking. In the thick of the worst of it, dishes still stacking, Hetty calling something sharp from the stoves. Cordelia looked for him across the chaos, not to check his work, just to see him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, cuffs damp, collar open at the throat, moving fast through the steam, without once looking rattled. A man entirely inside the work, the way she'd only ever been inside herself, alone for years, with nobody standing beside her who understood the weight of it the way he seemed to understand it now. For one full second, she forgot there was a room full of strangers waiting on either of them. He looked up, caught her looking. Neither of them looked away as fast as either one of them probably should have. Then a plate needed carrying, and the moment passed, the way moments do in the middle of a working kitchen. But something had shifted in it, small and unspoken, and both of them carried the shape of it through the rest of the night without saying a single word about it out loud. The last of the traveler tables were served before the hour ran out. The regulars hadn't been abandoned. One honest apology owed for the delay, nothing worse than that. Garrison Hollis stood near the door counting the room with his own eyes, the particular satisfaction of a man who'd bet on the right horse, settling slow across his face. "Where's a man learned to hold a service together under that kind of count?" he asked Silas. Once the worst of it had passed. Silas answered without shrinking it down the way he used to. Counted provisions for over 100 men, once. In weather that didn't wait on anybody's convenience. This wasn't so different. Whitfield, standing close enough to hear it, said nothing at the time. But later, on his way out, he stopped at the door long enough to say one thing quiet, meant only for Silas. "When your time here's finished, I want to talk to you about paid work. Come find me." Silas nodded. Didn't say yes yet. Didn't say no either. Dutch Radnor did not come to the supper. But word of it reached him, before the last table had even cleared, that Burns' table had taken 30, where it promised 24, and held, and that the drifter he'd tried to run off the road the night before had somehow somehow ended up 29 as in the middle of the whole triumph, instead of the wreckage he'd been paid to cause. He sat alone at his own counter a long while that night, turning a coin over and over between two fingers, and did not like, not one bit, the shape the week had taken, because a man like Dutch Radnor did not lose gracefully, and a name from 3 years back, one he'd buried deep and thought stayed buried, had just walked back into daylight wearing another man's face, a face that had, apparently, learned in the years since exactly how to hold its ground. Cordelia closed the account late that night, long after the last customer had gone and Hetty and Odessa had headed home, worn through but grinning the particular grin of people who'd survived something together. She counted the nights take slow, the numbers coming out better than she'd let herself hope for. Silas stood across the counter, finishing the last of his own tally, sleeves still rolled, collar still open. "You did good tonight," she said. "Plain. No more sentiment folded into it than that. So did you. 30 plates I never planned for, and not one table left waiting past what I promised them. 3 weeks ago I'd have called that impossible." She allowed herself something close to a smile, tired and genuine. "Tonight I just call it Tuesday." She looked up at him. "Radnor's not finished," she said. "Man like that doesn't let a loss sit quiet." "No," Silas agreed. "He won't. Then we'll be ready for whatever he tries next." Something passed between them then, not quite a promise, not quite anything either of them was ready to name out loud. Just two people, standing on the same side of a counter for the first time, The first having built something together worth defending, and both of them knowing without saying so that the fight wasn't over yet. Silas walked her to the back stairs before turning toward his own small room, an old habit from a life for trouble in life, spent watching covered in the dark that he hadn't quite shed, and one Cordelia found she didn't mind him keeping. "Get some rest, Rourke," she said, echoing herself again, the phrase becoming something like a private ritual between them, without either one deciding to make it so. "You too, Miss Byrne." Neither of them moved right away. Then she went up and he went out to the small room, and the eating house settled into the particular stillness of a building that had survived something hard and come through the other side of it standing. Outside, the town had gone quiet and dark, and somewhere across it, in a boarding house on the West End, a man who'd once ruined Silas Rourke's name was already deciding what he meant to do about the fact that it hadn't stayed ruined. Word of the supper traveled faster than either of them expected, because that was how it worked out here. A good story outran a bad one every time, and 30 strangers fed on. 30 strangers well, on a night everybody said couldn't be done made for act like the kind of story a traveling liked to carry down the road with them. Within a week, 2 more inquiries came through Burns' table's door. Smaller parties, easier counts, but real money and real proof that the growth Cordelia had hoped for wasn't a fluke born of one desperate night. Garrison Hollis himself came back through Larkspur, not 2 weeks later, a different party in tow, and made a point of stopping in, even though his business that trip lay elsewhere. "Told 3 separate outfits about the supper you two pulled off," he said, tipping his hat to them both. "Man in my line of work remembers who delivers when the count ain't on 'em, without warning. Expect you'll be seeing more of my business, and plenty of the business I bring with me." It was, Cordelia thought, about the finest kind of advertisement a struggling eating house could ask for, better than any sign she could have painted herself. She should have felt only triumph. Instead, she felt it sitting next to something else, something unsettled, because triumph, it turned out, came with its own kind of weight when a man like Dutch Radnor was still out there somewhere, nursing a loss. He wasn't built to swallow quiet. Radnor tried once more, not with a wagon this time. With words, the only weapon he had left once his first plan had failed, and failed loud. He walked into the Mercantile on a Tuesday morning, loud enough to be heard by every ear in the place, and told anybody willing to listen that the drifter working Burns' kitchen was the same man who'd been run off a cattle outfit 3 years back for stealing provisions from under 100 hungry men. "Thief," he said. Plain. Ugly. Meant to land exactly where it landed. That's who's counting Miss Burns' stock these days. Wonder she trusts him with the till at all. Mabel Cross, of all people, was standing near enough to hear it, and for once in her life didn't repeat a word of gossip forward. Told Odessa. Later she hadn't liked the look on Radnor's face saying it. Said it read less like a man sharing a fact, and more like a man settling a score. And Mabel Cross, whatever else she was, knew the difference. But not everyone in Larkspur had Mabel's instincts. The words moved through town the way words always did, fast and faster than the truth could ever hope to catch them. By afternoon, Silas felt it. In the way 2 men at the livery went quiet when he walked past. In the way a woman at the Mercantile pulled her basket a little closer, like a man's shadow might reach in and take something from it. He'd worn that look before, knew exactly how heavy it sat. Except this time, he told himself, standing very still in the middle of the street with his jaws set hard. Except this time I'm not running. Henry Voss found him there, in the middle of that particular silence, and didn't cross the street the way some men had. Just walked up plain, same as any other morning. Heard what Radnor's saying, Henry said. Figured most of town had, by now. For what it's worth, I don't put much stock in a word that man says about anybody. Never have. Henry shifted his hat back on his head. Man spent 30 years being neighborly to folks' faces, and something considerably less than that behind their backs. You held a room together for 30 strangers 2 weeks back. That counts for more with me than any story Radnor's peddling. It wasn't much. One old rancher's opinion, against a whole town's whispering. But Silas found he was grateful for it anyway, more than the size of the gesture probably warranted, and said as much before Henry ambled toward livery, ambled on toward the livery, unbothered the way he seemed to move through the whole world. Cordelia found him behind the eating house out that evening, splitting wood with more force than the task strictly required. Heard what Radnor's saying. Figured you had. It isn't true. Half of it is. He set the axe down, looked at her straight, because he'd promised himself weeks back never to hand her half a truth again. I was run off for it. That part's true. What isn't true is that I did it. I know that. Whole town doesn't. Whole town, Cordelia said, watched you hold a supper together for 30 strangers while a man who just tried to wreck your delivery hid behind his own front counter and let somebody else take the risk for him. That ought to count for something. Ought to. Doesn't always. She was quiet a moment. Then we make it count, she said. We don't run from this. We prove it. And if I can't prove it, if the only proof left is 3 years gone and buried with a camp that scattered to 4 different territories the week they ran me off, then we find what's left of it anyway. Her voice didn't waver. I didn't build this place, waiting for things to be easy, Silas. I don't intend to start waiting now. He almost argued it further. Almost told her that some fights weren't hers to spend herself on. A woman with this finally turning. The woman with a business finally turning. Real profit didn't need to hitch her name any tighter to a man half the town was already whispering about. But he looked at her, standing there in the last of the daylight, jaw set the same stubborn way it had been the day. She'd told him she didn't hand out charity, and understood that arguing her out of a fight she'd already decided to have was a losing use of anybody's breath. All right, he said. We prove it. Proving it meant going back 3 years, and going back 3 years meant a letter, and a letter meant waiting. The one part of the plan neither of them could rush no matter how badly they wanted to. Silas wrote to a man named Corwin Teague, the outfit's old trail boss, the only man left from that camp. Silas trusted to tell the truth even if the truth cost him something. Wrote it plain. No begging in it. Just the facts, laid out clean, the way he'd once laid out a supply count. The missing flour, the shortfall that wasn't his. The buyer who'd come through camp at midnight 3 winters back paying cash for provisions that should never have left the wagon. He didn't say Radnor's name in the letter. Didn't need to. Not yet. Just asked Corwin to remember, if he could, the face of the man who used to come around buying surplus off anybody willing to sell it quiet. Then he mailed it, and waited, and tried not to let the waiting eat him alive, because waiting was its own kind of hell, which he already knew, having done 3 years of it already quiet, alone, asking smaller and smaller favors of smaller and smaller towns until Larkspur, until Cordelia Byrne looked at him across a counter and asked what kind of work he needed, instead of deciding, before he'd said a word, that there wasn't any. The days crawled while the letter traveled, and Cordelia watched him carry the waiting different than she'd expected. Not restless, not pacing, just quieter than usual, a man conserving something. The way she imagined he'd once conserved a winter's flour stretched 3 days into 5. She found him on the back step one evening, well past closing, looking at nothing in particular. You don't have to sit out here alone with it, she said. Not much good company right now. Didn't ask if you were good company. Asked if you needed to sit out here alone. He looked up at her. She sat down on the step beside him, which put her nearly at his eye level for once. Both of them folded down small against the cool boards, and neither one of them said much of anything for a long while. But it was, he thought, about the easiest silence he'd sat inside in 3 years. What if the letter comes back with nothing? He said finally. What if Corwin doesn't remember? What if there's nothing left to remember? Then you're exactly where you are tonight, she said. Which isn't nothing, Silas. Whatever this town whispers, you built something here already. That doesn't unbuild itself just because one letter comes back empty. He didn't answer that, didn't need to. But something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when somebody finally says the thing he needed to hear and doesn't dress it up prettier than it has to be. Odessa, of all people, gave him the next small mercy a few days later, catching him alone in the back pantry, arms crossed, her usual blunt self. Whole town's talking. You know that. Aware of it. Yes, most of them are fools. Also aware of that. She leaned against the doorframe. For what it's worth, I've watched you work for near 2 months now. Man doesn't move the way you move, doesn't think the way you think, if he spent his life stealing from hungry men. I've known thieves. My own uncle was a fair one. Rest his miserable soul. They don't carry themselves like you do. That an official character reference, Miss Pratt? Call it what you like. She almost smiled. Just don't let Radnor's noise convince you the whole town's decided against you. Some of us did our own deciding a good while back. While the letter traveled, Emery Whitfield came calling with the offer he'd promised. Freightline needs a man who can keep a ledger honest, he said, sitting across from Silas at the eating house's quiet corner table, mid-afternoon, between rushes. Receiving. Stock. Records for every wagon that runs this territory. Real wages. Real standing. Silas turned that over slow. Where's the work based? Cheyenne, mostly. Some travel with it. Whitfield watched him carefully. It's a good post, Rourke. The kind a man doesn't get offered twice. I know it. Then what's stopping you? Silas looked past him, out the front window, to where Cordelia stood at the counter, laughing at something. Odessa had said, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind he'd only seen cross her face a handful of times since he'd walked through that door, 5 weeks back, with nothing but a canvas roll and a folded-up name he was ashamed of. Nothing's stopping me, he said. Just need to think on it proper. Whitfield nodded, like a man who understood exactly what kind of thinking that was going to be, and let it go at that. But before he rose to leave, he added one more thing. For what it's worth. A man doesn't hold a room together the way you held that supper together unless he's already found the thing worth holding on to. Cheyenne'll still be there whenever you're done, deciding what that is. Corwin's reply came 12 days later, and it came with more than words. It came with a name. Corwin remembered the buyer plain as day. He wrote, remembered him, because the man had come back twice more after that winter, trying the same trick on 2 other outfits down the line, until word finally spread far enough that nobody would deal with him anymore. Corwin gave a description that matched Dutch Radnor, close enough to leave no honest room for doubt. And more than that, Corwin had kept, all these years, a receipt. A single scrap of paper the buyer had signed without thinking, the night he'd bought a wagon load of flour, off a corrupt hand at half its worth, never once imagining anybody still be holding it 3 years on. The name on that receipt was Radnor's, plain as anything. Silas sat with the letter a long while before he showed it to anyone. Read it over and over, until the words stopped swimming and settled into something solid he could actually hold on to. 3 years. 3 years of asking smaller, of folding his own name up quiet in his coat pocket so it wouldn't scare him man off before he'd even finished asking for work. He brought the letter to Cordelia first, not the sheriff. Her. She read it standing at her own counter, the same counter where she'd first told him she didn't hand out to charity, and, when she finished, she set it down slow and looked at him with something in her face he hadn't seen there before. Not surprise. Something closer to fierce. We take this to the marshal, she said. Today, before Radnor has 1 more hour to spread 1 more word about you in this town. Cordelia, A signature and an old man's memory. It's not much to build a case on. It's not nothing, either. And it's a good deal more than you had yesterday. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. You spent 3 years letting other men decide who you were before you'd said a word. Not this time. This time you walk in with the truth in your hand, and you let them see it, and you let the town make of it what it will. But you don't hide it. Not anymore. Silas looked at her a long moment. All right, he said. The marshal read the letter twice, slow, unhurried, the way a careful man reads something that might matter a great deal. Then he sent for Whitfield, who'd handled freight contracts long enough to recognize a forged signature from a real one, and who confirmed, pasting the receipt beside a half-dozen documents Radnor had signed around town over the years, that the hand matched close enough to leave little honest doubt. It still wasn't proof enough to hang a man's ruin on. The marshal said as much, plain. But it was enough to open a formal inquiry, and enough, once word of that inquiry reached the man who'd tried to sabotage the wagon 2 weeks back, to change that man's mind about staying quiet. He'd been sitting in the town jail on a public drunkenness charge since the night after supper, having never quite managed to leave Larkspur the way he'd meant to. Faced now with a marshal holding a signed receipt and a formal inquiry into the very man who'd paid him, he stopped protecting a boss who'd never once come to check on him in his cell. He gave Radnor's name plain, this time with his own signature under it. Word moved through Larkspur that same afternoon, the way word always moved, fast, and this time finally carrying the truth instead of outrunning it. Radnor did not go quiet. He came to the eating house himself, red in the face, loud in a way that drew half the street to the windows. "You've got nothing," he said, pointing a shaking finger at Silas across the counter. "A dead man's memory and a scrap of paper. That proves nothing." "Corwin's not dead," Silas said. "And it proved enough to open an inquiry." "It proves enough," the marshal said, standing in the doorway behind him, having followed him the whole way down the street. "Enough that you'll be answering for a wagon that near failed on the Falls Road last month, too, seeing as the man you paid to do it just signed his name to it in my office not an hour past." Radnor's face went from red to something paler. "This town," he said, low now, ugly, looking for anybody in the room who might still on his side, believes a drifter and a... He didn't finish it, because Cordelia stepped around the counter, full height, and stood close enough that Radnor had to tip his head back to keep looking her in the eye. And something about the way she did it, calm, unhurried, absolutely unshakable, made the rest of his sentence die somewhere in his throat. "Finish it," she said. "Quiet. Go on. Whatever you were about to call me. Say it in front of the marshal, so it's on the record, right alongside everything else you've done in this town." He didn't finish it, turned, instead, and walked out, past the crowd gathered at the windows, and didn't look back once. The marshal lingered a moment before following him out. "Man's finished in this town, one way or another," he told Cordelia and Silas both. Quiet, matter of fact. A man who'd seen enough of Larkspur's business to know exactly how these things tended to settle once the truth got loose, whether the inquiry finds against him formal or not. Town's got a long memory for a man caught trying to wreck a woman's supper out of spite. Longer memory than it's got for most anything else, in my experience. He tipped his hat to Cordelia, nodded once to Silas, and went after Radnor down the street, leaving the two of them standing in a front room, gone, quiet with the particular exhausted stillness that follows a fight nobody quite realized they'd need to have that morning. The crowd outside didn't disperse right away. A few of them lingered, murmuring, and Henry Voss, standing near the front with his hat already off, out of some old habit of respect he'd never bothered to examine, said loud enough for the street to hear, "Well, Suppose we all owe Miss Byrne and her man an apology for the listening we did to that fool these past 2 weeks. Nobody argued the point. A few of them even looked properly ashamed of themselves, which was, hustling, Cordelia thought, watching from the doorway, about as much satisfaction as a person could reasonably expect to collect from a town that and three had spent 3 years deciding things about her before she'd said a word. Hetty had her own way of marking the occasion, which was to say almost none at all. She simply started setting an extra place at the family table. She kept for herself and Odessa in the back kitchen, without comment, until Silas realized after the third evening that the place had been meant for him all along, and that Hetty Marsh's particular brand of welcome arrived in the shape of supper rather than words. You could just say it plain, he told her once, sitting down at last. Could. Hetty didn't look up from her stove. Choose not to. Man who spent 3 years having his character debated by strangers doesn't need one more person telling him what they think of him. Just needs a hot plate and somebody who doesn't ask questions while he eats it. He didn't argue with that logic, and found over the following weeks that Heros of Sinsuffers did more for him than most of the sympathy the rest of the town eventually got around to offering. The waiting gave Cordelia and Silas more evenings together than the past 2 months combined, and they spent a fair number of them not on the inquiry at all, but on the business itself, the way a person turns to steady, ordinary work when the larger matters sit too heavy to face head on every hour of the day. Cordelia sketched out on the back of an old supplier's invoice what a second dining room might look like should the traveler trade keep growing the way it had begun to. Silas countered, with figures on what such an expansion would cost against what it might earn, and the two of them spent one whole evening arguing companionably over whether a second stove was worth the expense before the season's end, an argument that had nothing to do with Radnor or inquiries or old wounds at all, and felt, for exactly that reason, like the most restful evening either of them had spent in weeks. You're already planning past whatever the marshal decides, Cordelia observed, somewhere near the end of it. Man's got to plan for something.
Beats sitting stills, and waiting to see which ways a stranger's inquiry fails.
She didn't argue that either and let herself, for one evening at least, believe in a future solid enough to be worth sketching on the back of an invoice. The inquiry took the better part of a month. A town the size of Larkspur didn't move fast on a matter like this, not when a man's whole standing hung on the other end of it. And Silas found the waiting almost harder than the waiting for Corwin's letter had been, because this time the whole town was waiting alongside him, watching to see which way it would fall. The marshal called 2 more witnesses before he closed his findings. A supplier out of Cheyenne, passing through deep business, recognized Radnor's description from 3 years back as a man who'd once tried the same surplus scheme on his own outfit and had turned him away at the time on nothing sturdier than an uneasy feeling. And an elderly woman who did the boarding house's laundry testified reluctantly that tucked among unexplained cash tucked among Radnor's lins for a man of his stated income, though she'd never thought it her place to ask where it came from. None of it alone would have settled the matter. Together, laid out plain before the marshal's careful accounting, it fell the only way it honestly could. Once Whitfield's signature comparison, and Corwin's letter, and the jailed man's confession, and the supplier's memory, and the laundress's cash, all lined up, pointing the same direction, there wasn't much left to argue. Radnor lost the boarding house within the month, lost the standing he'd spent 30 years polishing, all of it undone by one careless scrap of paper he should have burned 3 years back and never did, and one man in a jail cell who'd finally had enough of protecting somebody who'd never once protected him back. Silas Rourke's name, meanwhile, cleared for the first time since that terrible winter. Word even reached the old outfit. Eventually, the way these things do, and though nobody there ever quite got around to an apology, worth the name, that hardly mattered anymore. Because the men who mattered now, the ones standing in front of him every day, already knew the truth and had known it for weeks before the letter ever arrived. He thought he might feel something larger when word of his clearing finally settled in proper. Some great unburdening, maybe, the kind a man imagines during the worst of his exile, picturing the exact moment his name might finally come clean again. Instead, what he felt was smaller and steadier than that, closer to the quiet satisfaction of a ledger that finally balanced after a long stretch of figures that refused to add up right. The old shame didn't vanish so much as it simply stopped being the loudest thing in the room. Cordelia, when he tried to describe it to her one evening, said that sounded about right to her too, that some hurts didn't heal so much as they got crowded out, slowly, by better things taking up the instead. Is that what happened with you? He asked. The church. Coal. Some of it. Most of it, maybe, if I'm honest. She didn't flinch from the question, which told him something about how far they'd come from that first careful evening of half answers. Some days, I still feel it plain as the day it happened. Most days now, though, I'm too busy running a business with a stubborn man who won't stop asking me smart questions to spend much time on it. He let that sit warm between them and didn't push for anything more than she'd already given. Something else shifted in Larkspur that month too, quieter than Radnor's downfall, but no less real. Mabel Cross, of all people, took to bringing her sister-in-law by for coffee most Thursdays and made a point, loud enough for the room, of telling anybody within earshot, Taubershot, that Burns' set table, the finest table in the territory, run by the finest businesswoman she'd had the privilege of misjudging. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was, Cordelia thought, about as close as Mabel Cross was constitutionally capable of coming, and she found she didn't need it to be any closer than that. Even the women at the punch table, the ones whose eyes had always traveled the length of her and flicked away caught, seemed to have found something else to occupy their whispering. A woman who had beaten Dutch Radnor at his own game, it turned out, commanded a different kind of attention than a woman merely tall enough to duck through a doorframe. Cordelia noticed the change without trusting it completely. Town opinion, she'd learned a long time ago, was a fickle current, and she had no intention of building her sense of herself on its tides ever again. But it was, undeniably, easier to walk down Larkspur's Main Street that month than Emin had been, and she let herself enjoy that ease without examining it too hard. He found Cordelia alone one evening, not long after, closing up the front room. Lamps burned low the way they always were at this hour. Whitfield's offer still stands, he said. Cheyenne. Good wages. A real post. She didn't look up right away. Kept wiping the counter. Slow, deliberate. Take it, she said. If it's what you want. That's not what I asked. She set the rag down. What are you asking then? He took a breath. Because this was the part he'd been turning over for days. Longer maybe. Since that first night, 10 weeks back when he'd watched her move through the worst of a 30-plate crisis without once losing her nerve. And something in him had quietly decided, somewhere under all the counting and the ledgers and the careful watching and watching, that he didn't want to be anywhere she wasn't. I'm asking if you'd rather I stayed, he said. Not as a hand you're paying by the day. As a partner. Somebody who puts his name next to yours on the door and means it and builds this place bigger than either one of us could build it alone. Cordelia was quiet a long moment. You'd give up a post in Cheyenne for a supper counter in Larkspur. I'd give up a post in Cheyenne, he said. For you. The supper counter's just where I happened to find you standing. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost something else entirely. That's a foolish reason to turn down good wages. Maybe. I'm not an easy woman to build a life around, Silas Rourke. Ask anybody in this town. They'll tell you plenty. I've heard what this town has to say about you. He held her eyes. Steady. Every word of it wrong. You're not too much of anything. You're exactly enough. Took this whole town 3 years to see it. Took me about 3 days. Something in her face broke open, just slightly, the particular kind of break that isn't sadness at all, but relief so long held back it aches a little on its way out. She thought of Nathaniel Cole for one final moment, not with the old sharp hurt she'd carried 3 years, but with something closer to distance, the particular relief of realizing a wound has finally, quietly stopped being the loudest thing in the room. Whatever he'd taken from her that day at the church, standing here now with a different man, offering her something sturdier than a wedding vow ever could have been. She found she didn't miss it, hadn't, in fact, missed it in longer than she'd noticed. She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she reached for the shawl hanging by the door, the way a shy person reaches for something to hold on to while a feeling settles. Walk with me, she said, before the light goes. He understood exactly what she was asking, the same way he'd understood the doorway that first night, without needing every word spelled out. He said yes. They walked out together, the light going long and gold across the boardwalk, and this time neither of them pretended it was for any practical reason at all. Fresh peaches, Cordelia said, somewhere, along the quiet street, when they're good enough to be worth the trouble. That's still what I'd put on the menu, if cost never mattered. Silas smiled. Then we'll grow the business till cost stops mattering. Whitfield's freight line runs clear to Denver these days. Man tells me they've started carrying fruit out of California some seasons, packed proper in ice. You've been asking him about peaches. I've been asking him about a lot of things lately. Fair warning, Miss Byrne. Partners tend to plan ahead. That, a promise. That's a partnership, he said, which, where I come from, is a promise that comes with paperwork. She laughed then, real and unguarded, the sound of it carrying clean down the quiet street. You never did ask me, she said after a while, if I thought you were trouble. That first day you came through my door. Did you? Tired, she said. That was the first thing I thought. A little trouble. Second. And now. Now I think you're the kind of trouble a woman doesn't mind keeping around. They walked a while longer in the kind of silence that didn't need filling, past the mercantile, past the church green where the spring social had stood weeks back, past the spot on the boardwalk where Henry Voss tipped his hat to them both without breaking his stride, entirely unsurprised, as though he'd been expecting to see exactly this for some time now. Silas thought, walking beside her, with his hat in his hand, the same way he'd carried it through her door 10 weeks back, that he had asked 11 men for work and heard 11 no's, and none of it. Not 1 hour of that hunger, that shame, that long walk into a town that didn't know his name, had cost him anything in the end, next to what it had brought him to. A woman who had built something out of nothing, with her own 2 hands, and never once needed rescuing, who hadn't wanted a man to save her, only one who'd stand next to her, steady and mean it. The new siphon went up the following Palms, a Sunday morning, chosen mostly because it was the one day Burns' table didn't open for trade, which meant a body could climb a ladder without a line of hungry customers watching from the boardwalk. Barn and Rourke's table, it read, freshly painted, the letters even and careful, done by Odessa's own hand after she'd insisted, loudly, that she wasn't trusting either owner's shaky nerves with a paintbrush on their own establishment's good name. Hetty brought out coffee for anybody who came to watch, which turned out to be a fair portion of the town, drawn less by the sign itself than by simple curiosity about a partnership that had become, over the past weeks, one of Larkspur's favorite subjects of conversation. Henry Voss stood near the front with his hat off, the way he seemed to remove it for any occasion he considered worth marking. Whitfield came by on his way through with a freight shipment and stayed longer than his schedule strictly allowed, remarking to anyone who'd listen that he'd once offered this man the finest post his freight line had to give, and watched him turn it down for a supper counter and a woman worth more than any wage Cheyenne could offer. Wasn't much of a decision, Silas told him, standing at the base of the ladder while Odessa finished the final letter. No, Whitfield agreed, looking between the two of them, Cordelia up on the ladder steadying the sign, Silas below steadying her. Don't imagine it was. Cordelia climbed down once the sign hung true and stood back to look at it properly, hands on her hips, the particular satisfaction of a woman seeing something built exactly the way she'd meant it to be built. Foolish way to spend a Sunday morning, she said, though nothing in her voice sounded like she meant a word of the complaint. Best kind of foolish there is, Silas said. She didn't argue that either, and the two of them stood there a while longer, the whole town's noise and coffee and gossip going on comfortably around them. Two names painted side by side above a door that had once opened for a stranger with nothing but a canvas strange roll and a hunger he'd learned to carry quiet, and now opened onto something neither one of them had built alone. Later, once the crowd had thinned and Hetty had begun clearing the coffee cups, Cordia stood alone a moment beneath the new sign, looking back down the length of the street toward the spot where, 11 weeks earlier, a tired stranger had stood outside her door, deciding whether it was worth one more knock. She thought of the 11 men who'd turned him away before she hadn't, and found herself, for the first time in 3 years, grateful to every single one of them, since it was their refusal stacked 11 high that had walked him finally to her door instead of somebody else's. She went back inside before the thought could turn sentimental enough to embarrass her, and found Silas already at the counter, sleeves rolled, sorting the week's deliveries the way he'd sorted that very first crate the day they'd met, and the sight of it, ordinary and steady and entirely his, settled something in her that she suspected would take considerably longer than a season to fully name. Larkspur is a fictional town. Cordelia Byrne, Silas Rourke, and the events of this story are works of fiction, set against the real backdrop of Wyoming Territory in 1881.